Today I'm going to give you some tips on picking out the perfect individual reptile for you. So if you walk into a pet store or go to a reptile expo, there's going to be lots of individual animals and you're going to have to be able to pick one. Even if you already know what species you're getting, just seeing a booth with maybe 100 different ball pythons, it might be hard to choose which one to go with, but I'm going to give you some tips on how to pick out one that will be best for you. Also, since we're talking about pet stores, I'll go ahead and throw it out there. I highly suggest you don't buy anything from Petco's or PetSmarts. I've talked about that in the past, and you can look into a bunch of different reasons why they should really be avoided. But we can go ahead and get into the different tips. And the first is to look at the different prices. Chances are you're going to have a budget on how much you can spend on that animal and need to make sure you can still afford all of the supplies and setup stuff. Hopefully you already have the enclosure set up right before you're about to buy the animal, so you already know how much money you have remaining. Each individual animal is going to be a different price based on a lot of different things, and it's really 4 specific things that are going to affect the price of different animals, and I actually talked about this in a separate video, so you can go check that out and then come back here. The second thing that's really good to find out is whether that animal is wild caught or captive bred. If an animal is captive bred, it means that someone already had a pair of animals that they've then bred and then produced the animal that you might buy. So that animal was not taken from an ecosystem, it was not imported from another region or country, and it didn't mess with any environments. It's always best to go with captive bred animals, but occasionally some you just won't be able to find, like certain lizards and frogs and toads just aren't bred enough or are too difficult to breed, so it's possible you'll have to go with a wild caught, but it's always good to avoid. If you see a little WC on whatever container it is, then that means it's wild caught, and CB is captive bred, and you can always just ask the person you're buying from to make sure. The next thing to think about is the sex of that animal. Females are usually going to be a bit more expensive because they're the ones that do most of the work in breeding, but in addition to that, different animals are going to be larger or smaller based on whether they're male or female. For example, I think every species of snake is going to be larger if they're females. An example, this is a male ball python, and although he's not full size yet, females are going to get about a foot larger, generally speaking, than the males. Certain lizards, the males might get larger, but it's good to keep in mind because they might need different enclosure sizes depending on how big they get, and you just might prefer having a slightly larger or slightly smaller animal. The next thing to think about is the age of that animal. That affects a couple things, one being how long you're going to have it. If you get a 1-year-old ball python or less than a year old, then it's possible you're going to have it for over 40 years because they have lived for that long before. If you go ahead and get an adult ball python that's maybe 15 or 20 years old, it will be probably a bit more expensive. However, you're not going to have it quite as long since it's already a good little ways into its lifespan. Some people just prefer having larger animals and don't feel like waiting for it to grow up. Personally, I like getting them as babies because I get to see them grow up, but some people just want to go ahead and get a full-size animal. If you're getting a pet snake, it's always really good to ask whether that snake is eating live or frozen thawed mice or rats or whatever it's eating. Usually you're going to want a snake to be eating frozen thawed animals because 1, it's better on the mice, and 2, it's going to be safer on the snake because if you are feeding a live mouse or rat or rabbit or whatever it needs to eat, there's a possibility that the snake is going to grab that animal, and then that mouse or rat can turn around and actually bite and defend itself from the snake, which can potentially injure, and it has killed snakes in the past. A couple of my animals were actually eating live before, but luckily they very easily transitioned over to frozen. It can be pretty difficult and some snakes nearly impossible to get them eating live over to frozen because it's pretty different. Also, something I forgot about is you're going to end up paying a lot more if they are eating live because it's going to be more expensive to go to the pet store and get a mouse there compared to just ordering a bunch of frozen online that were bred for feeding. It's always good to find out the temperament of the animal that you're about to get, so I always suggest if you are at an expo or a pet store that you go ahead and ask if you can hold it. If they say no for some reason, I would go ahead and move on to somewhere else, but then if they do, you can kind of get a feel. But if they do say yes, you can kind of get a feel of how calm it is, how docile it is, and hopefully they would already go ahead and know if it's potentially nippy or might try and defend itself. But it's something to keep in mind. If it's your first snake, you might want to go ahead and try and find something nice and docile. Even if it's your 10th snake or something, I still prefer getting animals that are already okay with handling. I guess some people might like getting those bit crazier animals and then they kind of have the job of taming it down, and that is definitely something you can do. Just about every reptile can eventually become more docile. This part also relates to the age, because younger animals are going to be a lot more easier to get them used to handling depending on what it is. For example, if you get a snake that's just a couple months old, it might not really know much about handling, but because it's so young, you can grow it up so that it's always used to it. If you get a snake that's already a few years old, it's already going to kind of have its personal opinion, I guess, on handling and different things, so it might be more difficult to get it used to handling if it isn't already. Finally, it's always good to make sure the animal you're getting is healthy. I'd say the biggest thing to look for are mites. Multiple different reptiles can get mites, especially like lizards and snakes, and they basically just look like these little black specks that might be under the scales. These mites just kind of sit under there and suck the blood of the animal. And although they won't be too harmful at first, if it gets super out of hand, it can be pretty dangerous and it's just a pain. Sunny, who I got about 3 years ago, he actually had mites when I got him, and because he was my first reptile I was ever buying, I didn't actually know what mites were. I needed to do a bit more research, but I had to deal with that with my first animal. And you can deal with it, it is just kind of a pain though. So if you're planning on getting something like, say, a bearded dragon, you could just go ahead and Google what bearded dragon mites look like so that you have an idea, and you can kind of just do a quick check while you're handling it. But this is going to be most common at reptile expos, because lots of different people are going to be bringing their animals, and some of those animals can potentially have mites if someone not so responsible brings their, I guess, infected animals. And mites can travel pretty well, so over the span of a couple-day expo, that gives the mites enough time to get from one animal or one booth to another, which I think is what happened with Sunny here. There's also just some other simple things you can look at. If you're able to hear the animal, I guess it would be kind of weird, but you could try and hear if the snake is like wheezing or sneezing or anything. This isn't going to be common and it's not too important because the chance of that isn't going to be too high. But if you do get the chance to listen to your snake while you're at the expo, you can just see if you can hear it breathing or whatever, and just listen for any issues like that. You can also look at stuck shed to see if there are any old bits of shed stuck anywhere. You can see if any of their eyes are foggy but they just shed, so maybe they have a stuck eye cap that didn't come off. And although these things are easily treatable, I wouldn't want to buy from someone who can't even get the shed off of their animal before trying to sell it to you. You can also look for missing scales or rotting scales, but again, these things shouldn't be too common. But if anything looks out of the ordinary, you should definitely ask, or you should just move on to another spot, because there's always going to be healthy animals you can choose. But that's just about everything I can think of on picking out the perfect reptile for you when you're at a pet store or at an expo or wherever. Let me know if you can think of anything else you should look out for when you are getting an animal, but this is everything that I could think of, so that'll be it for this video. I'm Alex, and thanks for watching.